Karim, why don't you tell me a little bit about Dropbox Ventures and the role you're playing?
Dropbox Ventures is an early stage corporate venture capital fund focused on, the next generation AI native companies. We typically invest in seed and Series A, although we're pretty flexible, but that's probably our sweet spot.
Mhm.
And like most CVC funds, we tend to work with lead investors for any given fundraise. We usually look for companies for which we can add value as a strategic investor, whether being a design partner or promoting them in our press releases, blog posts, or to our customers if they're aligned with our user base. The corp dev team at Dropbox has a hybrid role split between M&A and venture capital. When I joined Dropbox in 2020, I mostly focused on M&A. DocSend was an example of that.
Sure.
And then last year, when we launched the VC fund almost a year ago now, we started splitting our time between these two efforts.
Okay, great. You joined just about the same time I did, believe it or not, right before the acquisition. So thinking about pitch decks, that's the currency I trade in. I know you see a lot of them as well. What are some deck and storytelling trends you've seen over the past year or so?
Yeah, it's definitely been like an interesting time to be an investor in tech, given we have this like AI revolution, and you can kind of see the transition now. We're like a year and a half in. There's a clear shift from automating individual tasks using LLMs and like more point solution kind of offerings to companies' visions. Maybe they haven't realized the full vision, but now the vision revolves around automating a persona's daily workflows across different pockets of information, across different systems, and across different apps. In the beginning, most companies were, a wrapper around ChatGPT and attracted the what they call like the curious user base that would eventually or shortly churn out.
Sure.
That was probably like in spring of 2023. It was, a chatbot that adds one level of contextual awareness
Mhm.
to OpenAI's LLM, such as a file or a single point integration with one system. Um, the focus now has shifted to how can you automate a human behavior across apps, different apps, and across the manual work that used to take place for that specific persona,
Mhm.
using the right LLM for each subtask and staging the LLM requests by incorporating that persona's expertise in the application itself. For example, we're investors in Augex Labs. They were one of our first investments, and they focus on the video editing journey, specifically for social media. They take you through the video creation process from ideation to script writing to having your first cut, refining, adding the right narration voice, adding the right clips, etc. Every step is done using the right LLM for that task, and that tool represents a cohesive solution that automate that persona's end-to-end workflow versus, a specific task like we've seen in the beginning.
Sure. And that's a pretty distinct shift, especially because I'm still, I'm sure you are as well, seeing these first generation AI decks where it really is a chatbot layer on an existing task that frankly feels a little artificial.
Mhm.
And especially in comparison to these newer decks that automate workflows much more thoroughly and that are more invested in thinking about automating human behavior in deeper ways.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, it was AI everywhere, right? On every page, on every
Mhm.
slide. And at the end of the day, it was just an API integration with OpenAI to really embracing the AI revolution and rethinking about how every person does their job and how can we make their life better
Mhm.
from the ground up.
Sure, sure. Um, Investors have unique ways. Every investor has their own way of looking at decks, approaching stories, and evaluating companies. I know I built out when I became an angel investor, I built out, my own sort of process for evaluating a deck and a story. Yeah, I focus on narratives because my background is in storytelling and thinking about um, um, deep argumentation in addition to is this the right team for the right business problem? Are they making the right argument? And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about the kinds of stories that resonate with you, and how you go in and evaluate the stories that you're receiving as pitch decks.
Yeah, totally. I tend to look at companies or applications or visions, depending where they are in the process, as two different categories or two separate categories. The first category of apps are apps that are, a net new addition to the tools that an X persona uses,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And then the second category would be replacing a legacy tool. One is called like greenfield, and the other one is more brownfield opportunities.
Sure.
For both categories, the tool needs to add enough value to change user behavior. But in the first category, that threshold is much lower because you're automating manual work, right? Um, the green, so for example, the boom that we saw with e-signature, right, back in 2020 with COVID, it wasn't like an X player taking over Y player. It was all e-signature players replacing pen and paper-based signatures,
Mhm.
right, which was a win for all of the SaaS apps operating in that space. This is usually an indication of TAM expansion,
Sure.
which represents a big tailwind for companies that could create and expand their new market. Over time, as these tools expand, they could replace older tools as they offer more adjacent workflows, but they wouldn't necessarily be the land use case. On the other hand, the tools replacing the legacy tools, the brownfield opportunity, are a bit harder to sell, given that TAM expansion element is not there to the same extent as the greenfield opportunity.
Mhm.
And you have to fight with the older providers to take over their market share. You're also facing a looming threat from legacy providers, given that they already have the processes and the workflows implemented in
Mhm.
place, as well as the customer data, which will likely give them a big advantage as they implement AI technologies in their tool.
And I suppose that if companies are kind of nailing their relationship to either of these trends, those are the ones that are likely to stand out the strongest, I think. If you can, sure, set out customer pain points, what is the hair on fire problem being solved? Fine. But if you also have a more bird's eye view of what the industry trend is that you're responding to, is this a net new, or is it sort of a replacement of legacy systems? And where you fit in, where your company and where your specific solution fits in. Um, if founders can articulate that as keenly as possible, um, and concisely, specifically, I suspect that that stands out to you.
Yeah, and that reflects in the ROI of their tool and how they sell their tool to their customers
Mhm.
and convince them to buy the tool. Because at the end of the day, if you're replacing manual work, each human labor hour is probably the most expensive thing compared to
Sure.
replacing other systems.
Mhm.
So it does make it an easier sell as well.
Mhm. And I would imagine that it's probably fairly easy to discern that which founders have put in sort of deep thought into these kinds of questions, even if they aren't necessarily articulating them directly. You can kind of tell when a founder has thought, even indirectly, about what these questions mean and their implications.
Totally, yeah. In the first generation of AI companies that we saw, people were experimenting, people were curious about the AI implementations, but the visions were like pretty limited on like what you can do with it. And it was
Mhm.
focusing on one specific task, like writing code, right? Or editing an image. Versus now the vision, after a year and a half of the AI revolution, people were able to reimagine how work happens and how people do their jobs, and have a more cohesive vision that reflects that in new ways.
I want to move to some strategic advice that we can give to founders. In this video series, I like to present short snippets of thoughts I have based on conversations I have with founders, based on decks I see or evaluate that come into my inbox, and thinking about what we can do to give actionable advice to founders based on our own preferences, based on what we're seeing in the marketplace. And I'm wondering, if you could share some typical mistakes that founders make in your view, and what pitch deck sections tend to trip people up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a great question. And recently we did a session with HubSpot where we explored some of these topics on the pitch deck teardown session between DocSend and HubSpot. I mean, that's a great question. Most investors spend around, I think, like 2.5 minutes
That's about it.
on pitch decks. So it's really important to get it right for any fundraise. So I would say there's probably 4 slides that are really important. The business model slide, the traction slide, the market size slide, and the competition.
Mhm.
I'll just give a quick advice on each slide.
Sure.
For the business model one, that slide is more around how you're going to monetize and sell your product and to whom, right? It's kind of a lot of it is go-to-market related. I think one key point is that you need to touch on the key drivers for your go-to-market motion, but you also need to keep it high level, right? Because as an early stage startup, you don't want to penalize as you switch your go-to-market, and you will switch your go-to-market.
Sure.
You're still very early in that stage. So for example, if you're selling to enterprise customers, you don't have to specify the price, right? It could be TBD. And that's a simple example there. On the traction one, that's important because even though early stage investing is still mostly a bet on the founder, the team, the talent, and the business idea, showing any sign of traction, even at the seed stage, would go a long way for investors as they take the investment to the investment committee. Highlighting any design partners you have, any POCs that are taking place, or any user metrics, especially if you're a self-serve business, would be important. Maybe showing them over a timeline to show the growth of the usage of the product would also be beneficial here. For the market size, this touches a little bit on the earlier point I made around greenfield versus brownfield opportunities. But this top-down view is not only used for, the dollar TAM number, but it's really a framing around how you think about the market, how you think about your product, your end user, and the value add that your product is providing to get to that dollar number. So it's not just a circle and a smaller circle with 2 numbers. It's really how you think about these numbers and how you're going to capture that market is probably what matters here. And the last one for competition, this is a little bit tricky because if it's a slide that says you're the only one doing this in the market, or if you're the only one in the top right quadrant, usually that gets discounted when seen by investors. I think being honest here around the legacy players and the newcomers that you might be competing with would go a long way. The key thing here is to highlight why you think you're going to win the market and your differentiating points.
Especially in this last point, I've heard investors even recently saying, competition slides aren't necessary. And I kind of see their point to a certain extent. But by the same token, I also think that it's very easy for founders to get caught up in the thinking that I have to present myself as a unicorn, and we are operating in blue sky territory. I see this all the time. And I end up advising founders that some kind of competition evaluation is useful because one, it shows how you think and how you think about your present and your near-term future. But it also gives you a chance to de-risk your company a little bit for investors because they don't want to hear, in a voiceover or or in a pitch deck that you're operating in blue sky territory because that is very risky. And it isn't the unicorn signal that many founders assume it would be for investors.
Yeah, I mean, usually competition is a sign of a healthy market,
Sure.
right? So the more people are trying to solve that problem, usually the bigger the problem is.
Mhm.
So indicating that would help, and it's also helpful to educate your potential investors on the market and who should they be benchmarking you against.
Exactly, because many founders are raising from specialists and generalists.
Right.
And sure, you could have, a different deck for each set of investors, but that's a whole lot of work. And I think that if you can strike a balance of keeping it high level while doing this work, you're putting yourself in a really good place to show those differentiators and why they might be 50x, 100x differentiators in the end.
Right.
If you're thinking about If I'm a founder looking to raise today, let's say, what are some specific pieces of advice you'd give raising, let's say, for an AI startup in a market like today's, which is maybe not as uncertain as it was a year ago, but still not as like it was in 2021, say. Um,
Mhm.
how would you advise these founders?
Yeah. Um, I would say focus on the customer pain point, first and foremost. Um, and the problem that you're solving with the AI technology that we have today, and try to reimagine the workflows that each persona has. I think focusing on the customer, which is usually a specific persona,
Mhm.
will be the differentiator between the different AI startups. I personally think that building a horizontal AI tool will be very difficult, um, maybe like outside of LLM companies, right? So if you think about the application layer, um, I think instead we would have like different tools for different personas and different and specific workflows. Even if you look at the LLM companies like OpenAI, they're all starting to build their products around an ecosystem of use cases as a
Mhm.
differentiating factor. So going
Overall,
narrow.
where do you see early stage fundraising going in the next year? If I can ask you to think ahead a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the trends of the last year to predict next year's trends, I do see a lot more scrutiny around AI startups, um, and where, a simple LLM integration or putting AI on some slides will not be sufficient to attract capital.
Right.
That's similar to a trend I saw at my time at Cisco when I was covering the big data space. That the buzzwords will eventually like fade out of the
Mhm.
pitch decks. AI will become table stakes, and the focus goes back to the problem and the customer pain points that they're addressing. And then if they're a little bit more later stage, I would say like probably like starting Series A on the business performance and the company itself.
Mhm. Relatedly, let's assume this AI, the AI-ness of the startup ecosystem has become table stakes now. And
Mhm.
that's what you've sort of hinted at, this entire conversation. And I agree with you. Um, you and I are both, as I mentioned, still seeing decks with AI sort of sewn on to an early stage startup in such a way that the seams are very much showing. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering how you might advise companies at the earliest stages who want to build a so-called AI startup, but who don't want to do so in a way that's inorganic, inauthentic, and that looks tacked on, as it were, like we might have seen those in the irrational exuberance, you might say, of the first wave of AI startups, AI pitch decks.
Yeah, and I'm gonna tie it back to this focusing on a specific persona point
Mhm.
because it's gonna be an important one. I think, you know, and that given that early stage investing is a bet on the team, I think the team's talent is very indicative of their AI maturity in general. We saw a lot of, let's say like full stack engineers implementing OpenAI's API, and that's okay. But now, as we see more sophistication in the AI for AI native companies, looking at their engineering talent as an investor is a big indicative of their AI maturity. So seeing a lot of machine learning expertise among their engineering employees is usually a good sign. Knowing how to operationalize their models to drive an efficient use of compute resources is also going to be an important factor, as there's going to be a lot of shift on margins going forward. In the beginning, it was like, oh, this is cool. Doesn't matter how much, even if we're losing money, right, on every subscriber. It's cool that we're doing it. Now, all right, how can we make this a little bit more efficient? You're seeing trend of deploying LLMs at the edge. That's also part of it, because you're shifting the costs from the cloud to the edge on the user. And there's also performance reasons as well. So I think the machine learning talent that enables all of that work is going to be important. And then the second piece, which is related to the persona, is having the business expertise in your product teams is going to be very important as well. For example, I would expect a lot of lawyers to be working at a legal tech startup. If I don't see that, that's usually like a red flag on, do you actually know what the customer pain point is? Do you know what you're building for? Because at the end of the day, you're putting that expertise, let's call it like in a box, right? And automating it, which will allow companies to have the right logic that drives their AI systems and make them successful in the market.
Sure. I want to finish with a more pointed final question. What do you think the next generation of AI startups is poised to learn from this current generation?
Yeah. I think, definitely thinking a little bit more long term. Thinking about your long-term economic moat from the beginning is something that startups and investors will pay closer attention to, because at the end of the day, it will determine the long-term viability of the business. In the beginning of the AI boom, we saw a lot of ideas that quickly became obsolete, mostly because not that the idea is bad, but it's more because the incumbents had an advantage, a big advantage over the startups there, which was the user base and the data. So staying away from tools that could be seen as features, and focusing on, more full product vision, would go a long way, I think, for the next generation startups.
Sure. I think that's something I actually advise founders in working in any field, in any market. If this could be a feature, you might have a problem. It's easier to poke holes in it, right?
Yeah, and you don't have to build the full product suite from the beginning, but your vision includes that full product
Sure.
versus reviewing a line of code, for example.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kareem. It's been great having you.
Thank you for having me, Justin.